The ballroom of the Grand Meridian was a masterclass in expensive lighting and cheap sincerity. From my vantage point near the service entrance, I didn't look at the stage where Martin Hale was adjusting the microphone. I looked at the exits. There were 4. 2 were heavy oak doors leading to the main foyer, currently blocked by a pair of security guards who looked more like former college linebackers than professional protection. The other 2 were service corridors, tucked behind velvet curtains, accessible only to staff and people like me who made it their business to know where the floor plans ended and the reality began. My name is Evan Brooks. For 12 years, I have been the senior compliance auditor for Hale Manufacturing. In the world of logistics and heavy industry, I am the man who ensures the gears turn without catching on the fabric of federal regulation. I am the shadow in the spreadsheet, the person who notices when a shipping manifest doesn't align with the weight of the steel leaving the yard. I am quietly brilliant because I have to be. In this industry, if you are loud, you are ignored. If you are quiet, you are feared. Or at least that's what I used to believe. The Gala was a sea of charcoal suits and silk dresses, a celebration of a record-breaking fiscal year. But I knew the numbers behind the champagne. I knew the shortcuts taken in the third quarter to hit those targets. I knew about the safety bypasses in the Ohio plant and the creative accounting regarding the environmental runoff. I had documented it all, not out of malice, but out of habit. Martin tapped the mic. The sound echoed through the hall like a gavel. He looked every bit the CEO, silver hair, a tan that suggested weekends on a boat he couldn't actually afford, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze snagging on mine for a fraction of a second. There was no warmth there. There was something else, a hunter's focus. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martin began, his voice projecting a false sense of camaraderie. "We've had a year of unprecedented growth, but growth requires pruning. It requires the courage to identify the weights holding us back from our true potential." I felt a slight shift in the air. The people closest to me, men I had worked with for a decade, women whose children's names I knew, suddenly found the patterns on the carpet very interesting. A cold, dry realization settled in my chest. This wasn't a celebration of the company. It was a public execution, metaphorical, but no less total. Sometimes, Martin continued, his eyes locking onto mine now, the very people tasked with ensuring our integrity are the ones who lack the vision to see where we are going. They see obstacles where we see opportunities. They see rules where we see progress. He didn't use a teleprompter. He didn't need one. He had practiced this. "Evan Brooks," he said, his voice dropping an octave to ensure the back of the room could hear the gravity of his words. "You've spent 12 years looking at our past, but as of tonight, you have no place in our future. Effective immediately, the position of senior compliance auditor is being dissolved. We are moving toward a more agile model of self-regulation." The room went silent. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. In a corporate setting, being fired is one thing. Being named from a stage in front of 500 peers and competitors is a career-ending event. It is professional erasure. I didn't move, I didn't flush red, and I didn't look down. I watched Martin. He was waiting for a reaction. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to shout, to plead, or to storm out in a fit of unprofessional pique. That would validate his decision. It would prove I was the unstable element he claimed I was. Instead, I took a slow, measured breath. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the corner of the small, encrypted flash drive I always carried. It was a habit, a digital security blanket. I looked at Martin and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of submission. It was a receipt. I was acknowledging that the transaction had been completed. I turned and walked toward the service exit. My footsteps were steady on the polished floor. I passed my older brother, David, who was standing near the bar. David owed his current position at the logistics firm to a recommendation I had written 3 years ago. He also owed me $40,000 for a business opportunity that had vanished into thin air. As I passed him, he turned his head away, suddenly fascinated by the label on a bottle of scotch. I didn't stop. I pushed through the velvet curtains and entered the service hallway. The air here smelled of industrial floor cleaner and stale food, honest smells. I walked past a line of surprised catering staff and out into the crisp night air of the parking garage. The city lights were a blur of orange and white against the dark horizon. I sat in my car, a sensible sedan that whispered unassuming, and watched the digital clock on the dashboard. It was 8:42 p.m. The humiliation had taken exactly 4 minutes. I drove home in silence. No radio, no internal monologue of rage. I focused on the mechanics of the drive, the pressure of the pedal, the timing of the lights, the spatial awareness of the vehicles around me. I had been an auditor for a long time. I knew how to compartmentalize. I knew how to look at a disaster and see only the data points. My house was a modest ranch on the outskirts of the city. It was a place of order and quiet. I went straight to my home office, a room lined with filing cabinets and a desk that held a high-end workstation. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The blue glow of the monitors was enough. I sat down and inserted the flash drive. I didn't go to my current work files. I went to a partition on my secondary hard drive that was hidden behind 3 layers of encryption. The folder was simply labeled Historical Context. I opened it. The oldest file was a scanned PDF of a safety violation from 5 years ago. It was a small thing, a faulty pressure valve on a secondary cooling line. But Martin had personally signed off on the deferred maintenance order to save $6,000. I had flagged it then, and he had overruled me with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. "We're a team, Evan," he had said back then. "Sometimes the team needs to take a calculated risk." I scrolled down. There were hundreds of files. Recorded conversations where the legal department discussed how to mitigate whistleblower complaints. Spreadsheets showing the exact moment the company's pension fund had been leveraged to cover a shortfall in the CEO's discretionary spending. Photos of structural cracks in the foundation of the new warehouse that had been filled with industrial foam and painted over. I hadn't collected these things for revenge. I had collected them because I was a compliance auditor. It was my job to document reality, even when reality was inconvenient. I had waited for the system to work. I had waited for the board to notice. I had waited for the regulators to do their jobs. I had trusted the process. But the process had been subverted by the people who ran it. I pulled up my personal email. There were 3 messages. One was an automated notification from the company's HR portal, informing me that my access codes had been revoked, and my final paycheck would be mailed to my address. The second was a text from my cousin, Sarah, who worked in operations. "I'm so sorry, Evan. I didn't know he was going to do it like that. Don't call me for a few days, okay? Things are crazy here." The third was a voicemail from a friend I'd had since college, a man I'd helped get a job in the firm's legal department. I played it. "Hey, Evan. Look, man, that was rough, but Martin's on a warpath. He's telling everyone you were skimming or something. I can't be seen talking to you right now. I have a mortgage, you know? Good luck." I deleted the message. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was social. They weren't just protecting their jobs, they were protecting their proximity to power. They had watched a man get publicly stripped of his dignity, and their first instinct was to ensure none of the fallout landed on them. I looked back at the screen. The historical context folder was a map of a decade of corruption. It was a ledger of every lie, every shortcut, and every person who had looked the other way. I opened a fresh document and began to type. I didn't write a manifesto. I didn't write a suicide note. I wrote a schedule. Revenge is often portrayed as a chaotic, emotional outburst. People think of it as a fire, but a fire is unpredictable. It can be put out. It can burn the person who started it. I didn't want a fire. I wanted a slow, mechanical crushing. I wanted the sensation of a hydraulic press, slow, silent, and completely unavoidable once the cycle has begun. I noted the date of the next board meeting. I noted the expiration of the environmental permits for the northern facility. I noted the date my brother's largest loan payment was due, a loan I had co-signed as a favor, but had secretly collateralized against a private account he didn't know I controlled. The betrayal was the catalyst, but the documentation was the fuel. I had been the person who ensured everyone followed the rules. Now I was going to ensure the rules were applied with absolute, merciless precision. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of clarity. The quiet Evan Brooks, the man who stayed in the background and checked the boxes, was still there. But the boxes were different now. The first step was a whistleblower disclosure. Not a frantic one, but a professional, documented filing sent to 3 different federal agencies simultaneously. It wouldn't be anonymous. I wanted my name on it. I wanted Martin to see it coming. I stood up and walked to the window. The city was still there, glowing in the distance. Martin Hale was probably still at the Gala, basking in the glow of his own perceived triumph. He thought he had ended something tonight. He thought he had removed a nuisance and secured his kingdom. He didn't realize that he hadn't fired an auditor. He had unchained one. I checked my watch. 11:14 p.m. I went to my safe and pulled out a physical folder, the one I had printed months ago just in case the digital world failed me. I placed it on the desk and turned on a single lamp. The light hit the white paper, making it glow. I began to work. There was much to be done, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the time. I was the one who controlled the clock now. I had been documenting the truth for 5 years. It was time for the truth to do its job. Next, I would need to address the plant tours scheduled for the following week. Martin would be there, showing off the efficiency of his new model. He wouldn't expect me to be there, but I would be. Not in person, but in the details he had forgotten to scrub. I smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who has finally found the missing variable in a very long, very complex equation. The answer was finally clear. The reckoning had begun. The morning after the gala did not arrive with a dramatic flourish. There was no cinematic thunder, only the gray, persistent drizzle of a Midwestern autumn tapping against the glass of my home office. I had not slept, yet I felt an unnatural buoyancy, the kind of clarity that comes when a long-standing structural tension finally snaps and the building settles into its new, broken reality. I made a pot of coffee, measuring the grounds with the same precision I use for a quarterly audit, and sat before the glowing altar of my monitors. The first task was to verify the extent of the betrayal. It is one thing to feel the cold shoulder in a ballroom. It is another to see the mechanical evidence of it in the digital trail. I accessed the mirrored server I had established 3 years ago, a quiet legal redundancy I maintained for disaster recovery purposes. As I scrolled through the internal communications from the final 48 hours of my employment, the picture became uncomfortably clear. Martin Hale had not acted on impulse. The agile model of self-regulation he mentioned on stage had been a code word for a series of memos authored by my cousin, Sarah. For months, she had been feeding Martin's office curated snippets of my reports, reframing my concerns about safety shortcuts as obstructionist tendencies. She had traded my professional reputation for a promise of a vice presidency in the new regime. I looked at an email chain from my brother, David, sent to Martin's private assistant. David hadn't just ignored me at the gala. He had been actively lobbying for the company to move its logistics contracts to a firm he was secretly consulting for, using my internal data to help Martin optimize the transition. They weren't just stepping over me, they were using my body as a bridge. I felt a dry, metallic sensation in the back of my throat. Not anger, but a profound sense of disappointment in the lack of originality. Betrayal is usually a matter of simple arithmetic. They had calculated that the benefit of Martin's favor outweighed the cost of my ruin. They had simply forgotten that I was the one who taught them how to calculate. I picked up my phone and called David. I wanted to hear the vibration of his voice, the involuntary tremors that occur when a person realizes the ground beneath them is no longer solid. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Evan," he said, his voice thick with a performance of weary sympathy. "Look, I was going to call you. Last night was a lot. Martin went too far, obviously. But you have to understand the position we're all in." "I understand the position perfectly, David," I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. "I'm calling about the bridge loan, the $40,000. I'm calling it in." There was a pause. I could hear him shifting his weight, the sound of a leather chair creaking. "What?" "Evan, we talked about this. That's a 3-year term. I've got the kids in private school, and the new venture hasn't—" "The contract you signed has a material change in employment status clause," I interrupted. "Since I am no longer employed by Hale Manufacturing, the debt is due in full within 72 hours. I suggest you look at page 4, paragraph 6. It's in the fine print. You should have read it before you sent those emails to Martin's assistant." The silence on the other end was absolute. I didn't wait for him to find his breath. I hung up. Next, I dialed Sarah. She didn't answer. I didn't leave a message. I simply sent her a single PDF attachment, a copy of the environmental non-compliance report for the northern facility, the one she had helped Martin suppress. I had added a cover sheet that simply read, "For your records." The psychological pressure of a quiet threat is always more effective than a loud one. A loud threat allows the recipient to prepare, to get angry, to fight back. A quiet threat, a simple reminder of shared knowledge, forces them to live in the space between what they did and what might happen next. It turns their own imagination into a weapon. By noon, the rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and reflecting the steel-gray sky. I needed to move. I needed to see the physical manifestations of the data I held. I drove to the main manufacturing plant, a sprawling complex of corrugated metal and concrete that sat on the edge of the industrial district. I didn't try to enter the front gate. My badge was useless now, a piece of plastic that would only trigger an alarm and a visit from the security guards. Instead, I drove to a public overlook near the shipping yards. I sat on the hood of my car, binoculars in hand, and watched the rhythm of the facility. A plant has a heartbeat. You can hear it in the hiss of the steam vents and the rhythmic thud of the stamping presses. I watched the trucks entering and leaving. They were moving too fast. The safety protocols required a full stop and a visual inspection of the load straps at the secondary gate. The drivers were blowing past it, waved through by yard bosses who were clearly under orders to increase throughput at any cost. I timed the rotations of the security patrols. Every 20 minutes, a white SUV with the Hale logo circled the perimeter. There was a blind spot near the chemical storage tanks where the cameras were angled poorly, a maintenance issue I had flagged 3 times in the last year. It remained uncorrected. I watched a group of workers in high-visibility vests huddled near the loading docks. They looked tense, their body language defensive. Martin's efficiency was starting to fray the nerves of the people who actually did the work. You can only push a system so hard before the friction begins to generate heat. I stayed there for 3 hours, filling a notebook with observations. I wasn't looking for a way to break in. I was looking for the points where the company was already breaking itself. My revenge would not be an act of sabotage. Sabotage is illegal, messy, and beneath me. My revenge would be the simple, lawful acceleration of the inevitable. When I returned home, the first of the countermoves had begun. My bank sent an automated alert that my personal line of credit had been frozen. A routine review, they called it. I knew better. Martin sat on the board of that bank. It was a crude move, a blunt force attempt to starve me out. I opened a separate browser and logged into a private brokerage account. Years of disciplined saving and a few well-timed investments in logistics competitors had provided me with a buffer Martin couldn't touch. I moved $200,000 into a liquid account at a credit union 3 towns over. Then I began the process of filing the whistleblower disclosure. This was the part that required the most surgical precision. If I simply dumped all the evidence at once, it would be caught in the bureaucratic gears of the federal government for years. It would be buried under motions and countersuits. To truly dismantle Martin, I had to feed the information in stages, creates a sequence of events that would force the board of directors to turn on him to save themselves. I started with the occupational safety and hazard reports. I drafted a formal disclosure regarding the bypassed safety sensors on the heavy presses. I attached the internal memos where Martin had explicitly authorized the bypass to avoid a 3-day maintenance shutdown. I sent it to the regional director's personal office, marked urgent, immediate risk to personnel. I didn't stop there. I reached out to a contact I had at a rival logistics firm, a man named Henderson who had been trying to poach me for years. "Evan," Henderson said, his voice sounding genuinely surprised. "I heard about last night. The industry grapevine is humming. Martin really made a spectacle of it." "He likes an audience," I said. "I'm looking for a consulting contract, short term. I have some insights into the current inefficiencies in the regional manufacturing sector that might be of interest to your firm." "Insights?" Henderson asked, his tone sharpening. "What kind of insights?" "The kind that lead to market share shifts," I said. "I'm not looking to share trade secrets. I'm looking to provide a roadmap of where the current market leader is about to stumble. If you're positioned correctly, you can catch the business they're about to drop." "I'll have my legal team draw up a non-disclosure agreement," Henderson said. "Can you meet tomorrow?" "Tomorrow is fine, but I want the payment up front, and I want it handled through a shell corporation. I don't want my name on your payroll yet." "Understood?" I ended the call and felt a slight chill in the room. I walked to the hallway and adjusted the thermostat. The house was too quiet. For 12 years, my life had been defined by the rhythm of Hale Manufacturing. Now that rhythm was gone, replaced by the metronome of my own design. I went to my safe and pulled out a physical folder I had labeled the end of the line. Inside was a series of photographs I had taken of the structural integrity issues at the new warehouse. The foundation was settling unevenly, creating hairline fractures in the load-bearing columns. Martin had known about it since the concrete was poured. He had hidden the reports to ensure the project stayed on budget for the annual report. I looked at the photos for a long time. They weren't just evidence of a crime. They were a metaphor for the entire company. From the outside, it looked solid, impressive, and permanent. But underneath, the very foundation was failing, held together by nothing more than hope and a thin layer of paint. I picked up a red pen and circled the largest fracture. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I laughed. It was a short, dry sound that barely disturbed the silence of the office. Martin thought he had cast me out into the wilderness. He didn't realize that the wilderness is where I thrive. He had spent his life building a house of cards, and he had just handed the only man who knew exactly where the bottom card was located a very large fan. I turned back to the monitors. There were still 4 hours before dawn. 4 hours to refine the timing, to double-check the logic, and to ensure that when the first domino fell, there would be no way to stop the rest. I wasn't just an auditor anymore. I was the architect of a reckoning. And the first shift was just beginning. Pressure is a quantifiable metric. In my previous life, I measured it in pounds per square inch within steam pipes or the torque applied to a structural bolt. Now, I measured it in the frequency of vibrating phones and the length of the pauses in conversation. By Tuesday morning, the internal pressure at Hale Manufacturing was beginning to exceed the design specifications of Martin's carefully curated image. The board of directors had received my first anonymous packet at 8 a.m. It wasn't a rambling letter of grievance. It was a pristine spreadsheet comparing the actual maintenance logs of the Ohio plant against the falsified reports submitted for the annual safety audit. I had included high-resolution photographs of the bypassed sensors, each one time-stamped and verified against the plant's own internal GPS logs. I didn't need to sign it. Martin would know the source of such precision, and the board would know that the information was authentic. I was sitting in a nondescript coffee shop 3 blocks from the Hale corporate headquarters when my phone began to vibrate. It was a private number, but the timing was predictable. I let it pulse on the laminate tabletop, watching the screen light up and fade 3 times before I finally slid the bar to answer. "Evan," Martin's voice came through, strained and tight, stripped of the Gala's velvet resonance. "We need to talk. This game you're playing with the board, it's unprofessional. It's a violation of your severance agreement." "I didn't sign a severance agreement, Martin," I said, leaning back and watching a delivery truck navigate the tight turn onto the main street. "You revoked my access and terminated my position publicly before any paperwork was presented. I owe you nothing but the truth, and I'm simply providing it to the stakeholders." "You're overreaching," he snapped. "I can have you tied up in litigation for the next decade. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." "I already don't work in this industry, Martin. You saw to that on Saturday. Now I'm just a concerned citizen reporting regulatory discrepancies. If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting." I hung up. There was a specific satisfaction in being the one to end the connection. For 12 years, I had stayed on the line until he was finished. No more. I spent the next 2 hours at Henderson's firm, reviewing the logistics data I had prepared. Henderson was an opportunist, but he was a competent one. He looked at the projected downtime for Hale's northern facility, downtime that would be mandatory once the federal inspectors processed my disclosure, and saw a vacuum he could fill. He signed the initial consulting fee without a second thought. The money was wired to my new account before I left the building. The afternoon brought the first physical manifestation of the counter-pressure. I was walking to my car in a multi-level parking garage when a black SUV accelerated toward me, stopping just inches from my bumper. Martin stepped out, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his hair ruffled by the damp wind tunneling through the concrete structure. He looked like a man who was beginning to realize that his charisma had no power over a spreadsheet. "You think you're smart, Evan?" he said, walking toward me. He didn't shout. He used that low, menacing tone he usually reserved for middle managers who missed their quotas. "You think you can just walk away and burn the house down on your way out?" "I'm not burning anything, Martin. I'm just pointing out where you forgot to install the fire extinguishers. If the house goes, it's because of the way you built it." He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. I stood my ground, my hands in my pockets, my expression as neutral as a blank page. I had spent years observing his patterns. I knew he was a bully, and bullies require a reaction to function. I gave him nothing. "The board is asking questions they shouldn't be asking," Martin hissed. "They're talking about an independent audit. If you retract the filing, I can make this right. I can give you a bridge to a new firm, a clean record, a significant payout." "You're trying to negotiate with a process that has already been initiated," I told him. "The federal disclosure is in the system. The board has the data. You can't negotiate with gravity once you've stepped off the roof." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the first flicker of genuine unease in his eyes. He realized that I wasn't hurt. I wasn't seeking an apology or a payout. I was simply executing a plan. "You're a machine," he whispered. "No," I replied. "I'm an auditor. You just stopped liking the results." He got back into his SUV and sped away, the tires screeching against the polished concrete. I waited until the sound faded before I got into my own car. My hands were perfectly steady. The next phase of the plan required a more public touch. Martin was hosting a VIP tour of the flagship plant for a group of potential European investors. It was supposed to be the jewel in his crown, the final proof that his agile model was the future of manufacturing. He had spent thousands on new signage and fresh paint to hide the reality of the facility's condition. I knew the tour schedule because I had helped draft it 6 months ago. At 2 p.m., they would be on the mezzanine overlooking the main assembly line. I didn't go to the plant. I didn't need to. Instead, I contacted a former colleague in the maintenance department, a man named Marcus who had been passed over for promotion 3 times despite being the most knowledgeable technician on the floor. Marcus was tired of being the one to patch the cracks that Martin ignored. "Marcus," I said when he answered, "is the backup generator on the secondary line still throwing that intermittent fault code?" Every 4 hours like clockwork, Marcus grumbled. Management told me to ignore it until the end of the fiscal year. Why? I need you to pull the log. Not delete it, just pull it to the foreground of the diagnostic terminal at exactly 2:15 p.m. If anyone asks, tell them you were performing a mandatory safety check. Evan, if I do that while the investors are there, if you do that, the investors will see the truth. And when the regulatory sweep happens next week, your name will be on the list of people who tried to report it. You'll be protected. If you keep hiding it, you'll be the one they blame for the failure. There was a long silence. I could hear the background noise of the factory, the relentless grinding pulse of machinery. 2:15, Marcus said. I spent the afternoon in the public library, using their secure network to monitor the local business news and the company's internal social feed. At 2:40 p.m., the first ripple appeared. An investor had posted a photo of a diagnostic screen on a private forum, questioning the operational readiness of the facility. By 3:00 p.m., the rumor had reached the regional business journal. The story wasn't about a failure, it was about the discrepancy between what Martin said and what the machines were doing. It was a crack in the narrative. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the city, I received a text from Sarah. The board called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. Martin is furious. He's looking for a leak in the IT department. Evan, please, just tell me what you want. I didn't reply. What I wanted was irrelevant. What was happening was a logical progression of events. I drove to a small park that overlooked the industrial valley. Below me, the Hale plant was a hive of artificial light, a sprawling monument to one man's ego and 1,000 people's labor. I thought about the traitors, the brother who sold me out for a consulting fee, the friends who vanished when the wind changed, the cousin who rewrote my reports to please the boss. They all thought they were being practical. They all thought they were playing the game. They didn't realize that I had changed the game from poker to chess. And in chess, the pieces don't get to negotiate their positions once the clock is running. I opened my laptop one last time for the evening. I had one more file to prepare, the documentation regarding the pension fund reallocations. This was the final lock, the one that would ensure Martin couldn't just resign and walk away with a golden parachute. It would require a forensic accountant to unravel, but I had already done the legwork. I had the account numbers, the transfer dates, and the digital signatures. As I worked, I felt a sense of profound stillness. The world was moving exactly as I had predicted. The variables were aligning. The pressure was building. Martin Hale had spent his career building things that looked strong but were internally flawed. He had treated people like components that could be swapped out or discarded when they became inconvenient. He had forgotten that a system is only as strong as its weakest point, and he had made himself the single point of failure. I closed the laptop and watched the lights of the factory. Tomorrow, the board would ask for the full audit. Tomorrow, the regulators would arrive at the front gate. Tomorrow, the traders would find that their new alliances were made of sand. I was no longer the man who checked the boxes. I was the man who had designed the boxes, and tonight I was finally closing the lid. The silence of the park was absolute. The drizzle began again, a fine mist that settled on the windshield of my car. I sat there for a long time, not out of hesitation, but out of a need to savor the moment before the final collapse. Everything was in its place. The timing was perfect. The morning arrived with a clinical brightness that made the city look like a sterile architectural model. I spent the early hours in my home office watching the social and professional collapse of my former circle through the unblinking eye of my computer screen. It was a silent, digital disintegration. By 9:00 a.m., the news broke that the board of directors had officially suspended my cousin, Sarah, pending a full internal review of her department's reporting discrepancies. I watched the active status on her professional profile flicker and then vanish as her corporate credentials were deactivated. A few minutes later, I received a notification from a public records database I had been monitoring. My brother David's primary business account had been flagged for an emergency audit by his own creditors. The bridge loan I had called in was the first stone in a landslide. Without my backing, and with the sudden scrutiny on his consulting fees from Hale Manufacturing, his financial structure was folding like a paper tent in a gale. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a reputation's collapse. It isn't the absence of sound, but the absence of connection. My phone, which had been vibrating with frantic messages from former friends only 24 hours ago, was now perfectly still. They were no longer trying to explain or justify. They were retreating into the shadows, hoping that by staying quiet, they might avoid being caught in the searchlight I was sweeping across the company's history. At 10:30 a.m., I received a secure message from Marcus at the plant. He sent a single image, 3 black government sedans parked in the executive lot, positioned directly in front of the main entrance. The regulators had arrived earlier than my most optimistic projections. The diagnostic fault he had pulled to the foreground during the investor tour had triggered an automated alert in the state safety database, providing the necessary probable cause for an immediate on-site inspection. I drove toward the Hale headquarters, not to enter, but to observe. I parked in a public lot across the street, sitting in a small parquette with a sandwich and a bottle of water. I looked like any other mid-level professional taking an early lunch. From this distance, the building looked majestic, a glass and steel monument to Martin's ambition. But as I watched, I saw the motion behind the glass. Security guards were moving through the lobby with a sense of hurried purpose. Employees were gathered in small, anxious clusters near the elevators. And then I saw the board members. They were arriving in separate cars, their faces grim, their strides hurried. This was the emergency session Sarah had warned me about. I checked my watch. It was time for the high-tension meeting I had orchestrated. I didn't need to be in the room to control the narrative. I had already provided the board's chairman, a man named Arthur Vance, with a secure link to a virtual data room. Arthur was a man of the old school. He valued stability above all else. He had tolerated Martin's bravado as long as it produced results, but he had no stomach for regulatory scrutiny or public scandal. My phone buzzed. It was a calendar invite for a private video conference. The sender was the board's legal counsel. I accepted and opened my laptop on the park bench, tethering it to my phone's secure hotspot. The screen flickered to life, showing a mahogany-paneled boardroom. 6 people sat around a long table. At the far end, Martin Hale looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. His tie was loosened, and his usual tan appeared sallow under the fluorescent lights. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped over a stack of my printed reports. "Mr. Brooks," Arthur began, his voice echoing slightly in the large room, "we are currently in an executive session. We have reviewed the documentation you provided to the individual board members over the last 48 hours. I assume you found the data to be internally consistent," I said, my voice calm and professional. I could see my own reflection in the corner of the screen, unflappable, steady, and entirely removed from the panic in the room. "Consistency isn't the issue," Martin spat, leaning forward. "The issue is theft. You took proprietary data, Evan. You're violating every confidentiality agreement in your contract. We are preparing a multi-million-dollar suit against you as we speak." I didn't blink. "Actually, Martin, the data I provided falls under the protected status of the Whistleblower Protection Act. Since it pertains to active safety violations and financial misrepresentation of a publicly traded entity, my disclosure is legally shielded. Any retaliatory litigation would simply be another entry in the regulatory filing I've already submitted." Arthur raised a hand to silence Martin. "Mr. Brooks, the regulators are downstairs. They are asking about the foundation of the Northern Warehouse. They are asking about the pension fund reallocations. We need to know, is there more?" "The question isn't whether there is more, Arthur," I replied. "The question is how you intend to account for what has already been uncovered. I'm not here to provide a visual presentation. I've already given you the roadmap. I suggest you look at the Internal Audit Supplement folder. It contains the digital signatures for every override Martin authorized over the last fiscal year." I watched the members of the board turn their heads toward their own tablets. The silence in the room was heavy. I could see the moment the realization hit them, the moment they understood that Martin hadn't just taken shortcuts. He had left a digital thumbprint on every single one of them. By approving his bonuses and signing off on the annual reports, they were now part of the structural failure. "This is a fabrication," Martin said, though even he sounded like he didn't believe it. "I never authorized a bypass on the Ohio line. That was a departmental decision." "Paragraph 4, line 12 of the log," I said quietly. "You accessed the override terminal from your home office at 11:14 p.m. on the night of the 14th. The IP address is registered to your residence. The biometric login was yours." Martin slumped back into his chair. He looked at the other board members, searching for a crumb of support, but he found only averted gazes. They were already moving into survival mode. They weren't his allies anymore. They were the jury. "What do you want, Evan?" Arthur asked, his voice weary. "A settlement? A retraction?" "I want the process to reach its logical conclusion," I said. "I am not interested in a payout. I am interested in compliance. The company needs to be brought into alignment with the law. Whatever happens to the leadership is a secondary consequence of that alignment." I ended the call before they could respond. I didn't need to hear their deliberations. The momentum was now irreversible. I packed my laptop and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I saw Martin emerge from the front of the building. He wasn't in his SUV this time. He was standing on the sidewalk, talking animatedly into his phone, his gestures erratic. He looked small against the backdrop of the headquarters he had built. I spent the afternoon at a local library, far from the industrial district. I needed to ensure the secondary traders were handled with the same clinical efficiency. I had sent a detailed summary of David's consulting fees to the ethics committee of the logistics firm he was trying to join. By 4 p.m., he had been informed that his services were no longer required and that his pending contracts were being indefinitely postponed. The collapse of a social network is a fascinating thing to observe. It starts with a single point of failure, but the resulting tension pulls every connected thread until the entire web disintegrates. My brother, my cousin, my friends, they had all built their lives on the assumption that the system could be manipulated indefinitely. They had forgotten that a system is only a collection of rules, and when someone actually enforces those rules, the manipulation becomes a liability. As evening fell, the news cycle began to catch up with the reality. The regional business journal ran a headline about regulatory turbulence at Hale Manufacturing. There were mentions of unidentified sources and whistleblower disclosures. Martin's reputation, the one thing he valued above all else, was being dismantled in real time. I returned to my home and found a car parked in my driveway. It was my cousin Sarah. She was leaning against the door of her sedan, her face streaked with the remnants of tears, her professional poise completely gone. "Evan," she said as I stepped out of my car, "you have to stop this. They've suspended me. They're talking about a permanent ban from the industry. I have a mortgage. I have a life." "You had a life built on the alteration of my reports, Sarah," I said, walking past her toward my front door. "You chose to exchange my professional integrity for a promotion. This isn't something I'm doing to you. This is the consequence of what you did." "I was just doing what Martin told me," she cried. "Everyone does it. It's just how things work." "It's how things worked until they didn't," I said, stopping at the door and looking back at her. "The audit doesn't care about your reasons. It only cares about the data, and the data says you falsified the environmental logs." "You're a monster," she hissed, her voice cracking. "You're sitting there so calm while everyone's life is falling apart." "I'm not a monster, Sarah. I'm a compliance auditor. I'm simply the only person in this story who is actually doing their job." I went inside and locked the door. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel a sense of joy. I felt the same quiet satisfaction I got from a perfectly balanced ledger. The errors were being corrected. The outliers were being removed. I went to my office and checked the final rehook for the day. The regulators had issued a temporary cease and desist order for the northern facility. The entire plant would be shut down for 48 hours for a full safety inspection. Martin's attempt to flee the narrative was failing. He had tried to release a statement claiming he was cooperating fully with a routine inquiry, but the board had countered it with their own press release, stating they were conducting a comprehensive leadership review. The net was tightening. The tension was at its peak. Tomorrow, the physical and professional reality of Martin's world would finally meet the data I had been collecting for 5 years. I sat in the dark, watching the city lights. The first 3 acts were complete. The logic was locked. There was no way out for him now, and no way back for the others. The story was approaching its final equilibrium. The corporate office of Hale Manufacturing was a cavern of glass and silence. By Thursday morning, the atmosphere had shifted from frantic panic to a heavy, stagnant dread. The board of directors had made their move at 6 a.m., issuing a statement that Martin Hale had been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. It was the sanitized, professional equivalent of a lockout. His name had already been removed from the digital directory in the lobby, leaving a blank space that felt more substantial than his actual presence had ever been. I arrived at the headquarters at 10:01 a.m. I didn't need a badge. I was escorted by the board's legal counsel, a man who now spoke to me with the hushed, reverent tone one might use for a high-stakes witness or a ticking mechanism. He led me past the executive floor where assistants were packing boxes in a rhythmic, mechanical fashion. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and expensive floor wax. "Mr. Hale is in his private suite," the lawyer whispered as we reached the double mahogany doors. "The board has allowed him 30 minutes to collect his personal items. He asked to see you. We've advised against it, but given your role in the current restructuring, the chairman felt it might be productive to allow a brief meeting." "Productive is one word for it," I said. I pushed open the doors. The office was vast, overlooking the city's industrial spine. Martin was standing by the window, his back to the room. He wasn't packing. He was just looking out at the sprawling complex he no longer controlled. He had stripped his desk of his family photos and his crystal awards, leaving only a leather-bound blotter and a single heavy glass of water. "They offered you a settlement, didn't they?" Martin said without turning around. His voice was sandpaper, dry and thin. "Arthur told me they were prepared to pay you a significant sum to sign a non-disparagement agreement and walk away. He thinks he can still save the reputation of the firm if you stop feeding the regulators." "They offered," I said, staying near the door. I didn't sit down. I declined. Martin turned then. He looked hollow. The arrogance that usually functioned as his armor had been stripped away, revealing a man who had forgotten how to exist without a title. "Why? You've won. You've dismantled my life. You've humiliated your family. What else is there to gain? If you take the money, you can disappear. You can start over." "Starting over implies that I made a mistake," I said. "I didn't. I'm finishing a report, Martin. An audit isn't complete until the discrepancies are corrected and the consequences are realized. A payout is just another shortcut. It's the same logic that led you to bypass the pressure valves in Ohio. You think you can pay the friction to go away, but physics doesn't work that way, and neither do I." I walked toward the desk, my movements slow and deliberate. I placed a thin manila folder on the blotter. "The board thinks this ends with your resignation. They think the rest of the file is just more of the same, safety violations, minor financial irregularities. They haven't looked at the pension fund reallocation trail yet. Not the surface level, the deep one." Martin's eyes flickered to the folder. For the first time, I saw a flash of genuine, unadulterated fear. It wasn't the fear of a man losing his job. It was the fear of a man realizing the walls of his cell were moving inward. "I didn't take that money for myself," he whispered, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I moved it to shore up the acquisition of the Southside plant. It was for the company." "The intent is irrelevant to the ledger," I replied. "You moved protected employee assets into a high-risk venture without disclosure. You forged the signatures of the trustees. That isn't a management decision, Martin. That is a crime. And because I documented the trail 5 years ago, before you even finalized the transfer, it shows premeditation." I leaned in, my voice dropping to a calm, clinical whisper. "I'm not here to shout at you. I'm not here to tell you that you're a bad person. I'm here to tell you that the timing is now locked. The forensic accountants will find the secondary accounts by noon tomorrow. The federal authorities have already been briefed on where to look. There is no version of the future where you keep your assets or your freedom." Martin sank into his chair. He looked small, dwarfed by the high-backed leather. "You've been planning this for 5 years? Even when we were having dinner? Even when I gave you that bonus for the logistics overhaul?" "I wasn't planning your ruin, Martin. I was doing my job. I recorded the data. If you hadn't chosen to humiliate me, if you hadn't tried to erase my career to cover your own tracks, this folder might have stayed in my safe for another 10 years. You were the one who moved the timeline forward. You chose the venue, you chose the audience. I just provided the facts." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the muffled sound of a siren drifted up from the street, a reminder that the world was still moving, oblivious to the collapse occurring in this room. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you leave," I said. "You walk out of this building. You go home. You wait for the phone to ring. Your brother won't answer. Sarah won't answer. Your lawyers will tell you that they can't help you because the evidence is too clean, too well documented. You will spend every minute of the next few months realizing that every person you thought you owned was just a temporary variable in a calculation that has finally reached its end." I turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "One more thing. I've scheduled a final meeting for tomorrow evening. Off the record, a private location. I think you'll want to be there." "Why?" Martin asked, a spark of desperate hope in his eyes. "Is there a deal?" "No deal," I said. "Just a final observation. I think it's important for you to understand the exact moment you lost control. Most people never get to see that. I'm giving you the gift of clarity." I walked out of the suite, leaving him alone in the center of his empty kingdom. The rest of the day was a blur of procedural movements. I met with the forensic team, pointing them toward the hidden directories I had mentioned to Martin. I watched as the HR department issued a mass email announcing the restructuring of the logistics and operations divisions. My brother David's name was on the list of terminated consultants. Sarah's name was listed under permanent separation. I felt a slight vibration in my pocket. It was a message from David. "Evan, please." "The bank is foreclosing on the townhouse." I didn't know Martin was skimming the pensions. I was just trying to get ahead. "You can't let this happen to your own family." I deleted the message without responding. Family is a social construct based on mutual support and trust. David had liquidated that trust the moment he whispered in Martin's ear. He was now just another line item in a bankruptcy filing. As the sun began to set, the city took on a bruised, purple hue. I drove to my home office and began the final preparations for the meeting. This wasn't for the board or the regulators. This was for the internal logic of the story. I looked at the original file from 5 years ago. It was a simple observation of a mismatched invoice, a small error. A tiny crack in the foundation. I had watched that crack grow, month by month, year by year. I had watched Martin fill it with lies and Sarah cover it with false reports. I had watched as they built an entire skyscraper on top of that crack, convinced that because it hadn't fallen yet, it never would. They were wrong. Every system has a limit. Every structure has a point of catastrophic failure. My role was simply to ensure that the failure happened at the exact time and place of my choosing. I felt a sense of profound calm. The anger I might have felt on the night of the gala had long since evaporated, replaced by the cool, steady satisfaction of a completed project. I wasn't a hero, and I wasn't a villain. I was an auditor. I was the person who ensured that the reality of the ledger matched the reality of the world. I checked the weather report for the following evening. A storm was moving in from the lake, high winds, heavy rain, a drop in temperature. Perfect conditions for a final reckoning. A storm provides a natural sense of isolation, a way to ensure that the final words are heard only by the people they are intended for. I closed my laptop and stood up. My house was quiet, the air still and cool. I walked through the rooms, noting the order and the lack of clutter. This was my life. It was a life of precision and restraint. Martin had tried to take it from me, to replace it with a narrative of failure and shame. He had failed. Tomorrow, the final domino would fall. The story would end, not with a roar or a flourish, but with the quiet, inevitable click of a lock sliding into place. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I stood by the window, watching the distant lights of the factory. The plumes of steam from the vents looked like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. The plant was still running, but the heartbeat was different now. The rhythm was mine. I thought about the final line of my report. It wouldn't be a summary of crimes or a list of recommendations. It would be a simple statement of fact. The system has reached equilibrium. I drank the water and went to bed. For the first time in 5 years, I didn't need to check the files before I slept. The data was safe. The outcome was certain. The storm arrived exactly as the meteorological models predicted. By 7 p.m., the city was draped in a thick, oscillating curtain of rain that turned the industrial district into a landscape of blurred neon and shimmering asphalt. The wind howled through the steel girders of the construction sites, a low, mournful sound that felt like the voice of the city itself. I sat in my car on the 4th level of the Pierpont parking structure, a concrete monolith that overlooked the river. This was the location I had specified in the final message to Martin. It was neutral, cold, and, at this hour, completely deserted. I watched the entrance ramp through the rhythmic sweep of my windshield wipers. At 7:15 p.m., a pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the gloom. A silver sedan, far more modest than the luxury SUV Martin usually favored, crept up the ramp and came to a halt 20 feet from my bumper. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The rain hammered against the roof of my car, a relentless, percussive static. I stepped out into the cold air. The wind immediately caught my coat, pulling at the fabric. I walked to the edge of the structure, leaning against the concrete barrier. Below me, the river was a churning mass of black water, reflecting the lights of the Hale Manufacturing plant 2 miles downstream. I heard a car door close. Martin approached, his shoulders hunched against the rain. He wasn't wearing a coat. His expensive suit was already beginning to saturate, the fabric clinging to his frame. He looked older, smaller, as if the loss of his title had caused a physical contraction of his presence. "You came?" I said, my voice carrying over the wind without effort. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" Martin replied. He stopped 5 feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "The board officially terminated my contract an hour ago. No severance, no stock options. They're claiming cause based on the pension files you released. They've already frozen my personal accounts pending the investigation." "The logic of the system is finally asserting itself," I said. "When you remove the constraints of regulation, you create a vacuum. Eventually, the vacuum collapses. You're simply experiencing the atmospheric pressure of your own decisions." "Is that what this is to you?" Martin asked, his voice rising with a sudden, sharp edge of resentment. "A physics experiment? You ruined hundreds of lives, Evan. David is losing his house. Sarah is being blacklisted. My family, we're finished. All because you couldn't handle a bit of public embarrassment at a gala." I turned to look at him. My expression remained neutral, my pulse steady. "You're still misreading the data, Martin. This was never about the gala. The gala was just the moment you became a variable that needed to be managed. You believe you are the victim of my malice. In reality, you are the victim of your own inaccuracy. You built a company on the assumption that the truth was negotiable. I simply proved that it isn't." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card. It was my original employee ID, the one from 12 years ago. I held it out, letting the rain wash over the plastic. When I started at Hale, I believed in the structure, I said. I believed that if I did my job with absolute precision, the company would thrive. I thought you were the architect, but over time I realized you were just a decorator. You cared about the paint and the lights, while the foundation was rotting. I didn't create the rot, Martin. I only cataloged it. And you enjoyed it, Martin hissed, watching us, collecting our mistakes like trophies. You sat in those meetings for years, nodding along while you were building a gallows in your basement. I was doing my job, I repeated. An auditor doesn't stop auditing because the results are unpleasant. If I had stopped, I would have been just as complicit as Sarah or David. They chose to participate in the fiction. I chose to remain in the reality. I walked back to my car and adjusted its position, pulling forward until I blocked the exit lane of the level we were on. It was a temporary, legal positioning, a minor traffic violation at most, but it created a physical barrier between Martin and the ramp. I wanted him to feel the sensation of being contained, of having the exits blocked not by force, but by the simple presence of a deliberate obstacle. The regulators will be at your home tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., I told him, leaning against my car door. They have the warrants for the secondary ledgers, the ones you kept in the private cloud server under your wife's maiden name. I found the access codes in the backup logs of the IT department's old server. Martin's face went pale, a ghostly white under the flickering sodium lights of the parking garage. How? I deleted those. I saw the confirmation. Nothing is ever truly deleted in a digital system, Martin. It just becomes less accessible to the casual observer. But to an auditor, the absence of a file is often more telling than its presence. I tracked the ghosts of the data until they led me to the source. I looked out at the river again. The storm was intensifying, the wind shaking the heavy concrete pillars of the structure. The folder I opened on the night of the gala, you thought I started it then. But it began 5 years ago. It began when you asked me to overlook the first safety violation. I realized then that the person I was working for didn't exist. The Martin Hale who valued integrity was a marketing projection. The real Martin Hale was a series of shortcuts. So what now? Martin asked, his voice breaking. You've taken everything. My money, my reputation, my future. Do you want me to beg? Do you want an apology? I don't want anything from you, Martin. I brought you here so you would understand that this isn't a conflict, it's a correction. You are a faulty component that has been removed from the machine. The machine will continue. The company will be restructured. People will lose their jobs, yes, but the ones who remain will be safe. The pensions will be restored by the insurance bonds. The truth has been reinstated as the primary operating principle. I checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. The timing was exact. I have one more file to upload, I said, the one that links the board's chairman, Arthur Vance, to the initial approval of the Southside acquisition. He wasn't as innocent as he pretended to be in that meeting yesterday. He knew about the risks. He just thought you would be the one to take the fall if things went wrong. Martin looked at me with a mixture of horror and realization. You're taking him down too? You're dismantling the whole board? I'm completing the audit, I said. A partial correction is just another form of inaccuracy. To truly fix the system, every compromised element must be identified and addressed. I got back into my car and started the engine. The dashboard lights hummed to life, a comforting, familiar glow. I looked at Martin through the glass. He was standing in the rain, a solitary figure in an empty space, surrounded by the ruins of an empire he had never truly owned. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. I put the car in gear and slowly backed away, clearing the exit lane. Martin didn't move. He didn't try to stop me, and he didn't try to speak. He simply watched as I turned the wheel and began the descent down the ramp. As I drove out of the parking structure and onto the rain-slicked streets, I felt a sense of finality that was as clean and sharp as a fresh blade. The story was over. The variables had been resolved. The ledger was balanced. I drove toward the highway, leaving the industrial district behind. I thought about the twist that Martin would never understand. He thought I had changed, that I had become cold or vengeful. But I hadn't changed at all. I was the same man who had walked into Hale Manufacturing 12 years ago with a clipboard and a commitment to the rules. The only thing that had changed was the scale of the application. Everyone else had shifted. They had drifted into the gray areas, the compromises, the comfortable lies. They had moved away from the center, and when I refused to move with them, they saw me as an enemy. They didn't realize that I was the only thing that remained stationary. The highway was nearly empty, the taillights of the few cars ahead of me blurring into long red streaks on the wet pavement. I switched on the radio to a station that played quiet, instrumental music. The sound filled the cabin, a perfect accompaniment to the rhythm of the rain. I reached my house and parked in the driveway. The lights were off, the windows dark. It was a place of order, of quiet, and of absolute truth. I went inside, removed my wet coat, and hung it in the hallway. I walked to my office and sat down at my desk. One final keystroke, one final upload. I watched the progress bar as the last of the data moved from my secure server to the regulatory portal. When it reached 100%, a small green checkmark appeared on the screen. Submission successful. I closed the laptop. The blue light faded, leaving the room in the soft, natural glow of the street lamp outside. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain on the roof. The system was back in equilibrium. The errors had been corrected. The audit was closed. I stood up and walked to the window. In the distance, the city continued to glow. A vast, complex organism that would always require someone to watch the gears, to count the costs, and to document the truth. I was Evan Brooks. I was an auditor. And tonight, for the first time in 5 years, the world was exactly as it appeared to be.